happening, gang? Back live in the Secret Stash, Real Talk Radio, San Diego, hanging out with my man, Rick Boyer, attorney at law, the law offices of Richard L. Boyer. And you can catch him, by the way, at boyerlaw.net. Man, this has been a fun conversation, Rick.
Well, for me too, Jesse. Thank you.
Had a lot of fun hashing out all things vacation rentals. Man, I feel like this is just going to be a tale that keeps on growing, right?
Well,
pardon the pun.
Right.
What else? We talked about some things, some fraud stuff, right? The thing that no one wants to talk about. But if you're inside, actually either side of a transaction right now, those are two things you got to make sure you're are queued up in your heightened awareness to make sure you're not victim of. And then lastly, disclosure stuff, or failure to disclose, should say better.
Right.
We hashed out mold, cracked slabs, zoning, and then property disputes.
Right.
All good stuff.
You know, one thing I'd add as a buyer in a real estate transaction, I'm sure you've seen this in your real estate business too, but with the demand for inventory that has been out there for so long and now is finally starting to break. A lot more properties are hitting the market. Buyers are looking for properties. We're seeing a lot of properties that are hitting the market after being in a foreclosure, after being purchased through a foreclosure or
a highly distressed state, like a short sale even.
Yeah, exactly. And it's those where the buyer should be particularly conscious of that fact and the fact that there may not be that history that you would get if you had an owner-occupant living in the property for a number of years beforehand. You're going to get perhaps a real estate company who's bought that to flip the property, which isn't necessarily bad, but just to be aware that they may not know the actual condition of the property in all cases.
Or care to know.
Or care to know, true. Sometimes they're looking to buy it low and sell it high, and they will sometimes cut corners in that process. I've seen that in my practice. So in those situations, and a lot of times those are really good for buyers. You can get good deals on those properties, but just be aware that I've seen it happen so many times, as all real estate lawyers in town have, that buyers will enter into those transactions, buy the property, move in, and then find that it's not exactly what they thought it was.
Yeah, well said. Now, I guess the only other thing that comes up for me is just kind of thinking about moving this conversation toward you or in this direction. If any of this conversation has piqued any of Stash Nation over the course of the last hour, like, I guess maybe to put this bluntly, like they don't all have to end in litigation.
Right.
Right. And shouldn't that almost be a goal?
Well, actually, no. And any lawyer who is doing a good job for his clients will advise the client that litigation, meaning as we're talking about it now, what I mean is lawsuits. That should be a last resort for the lawyer and for the client. And disputes do not have to end in a lawsuit, and most of the time they don't, frankly. So we do our best to try to resolve those disputes before they become a lawsuit. We will, try to work it out through letters to the other side, explaining the rights and facts as we see them, and see if we can get it resolved through a series of negotiations. If that works, then everybody's in much better shape. Sometimes we have to go to a mediation, and there are some great mediators here in town.
And that's sort of like the halfway point, right?
Yeah. You get a neutral mediator. A lot of times they're retired judges, but not always. Sometimes they're very experienced lawyers who are very good at mediating disputes, and they'll act as a neutral mediator between the parties. They'll listen to both sides and try to get the parties to come to a non-binding resolution. If they come to a settlement, then they reduce that to a settlement agreement. But, there's no obligation there. But a lot of times those mediators are very effective at resolving disputes. And then, if they're in a real estate dispute over a transaction, and if they've used that car agreement, they will have an obligation to arbitrate that dispute. So,
right. So
we'll end in arbitration sometimes, and that's the equivalent of a lawsuit if you're in a real estate transaction dispute. In other cases, in a variety of different disputes, we will end up in a lawsuit. But again, that should be the last resort. And, every lawyer, every reputable lawyer who is doing a good job for his client will do everything he can to avoid that lawsuit because they're expensive, they're stressful, and they take a long time to get resolved that way.
even I've heard it said, even when you win, it doesn't necessarily even feel like you won.
Right. Yeah, winners even feel like they've been through the ringer.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, let's say that, maybe that message that you shared with me has inspired me to reach out to you for, some personal issue that I got kind of brewing or ruminating around. What's the best way that someone can look you up?
Well, they should call me at the number that you've been giving, 858-481-8757, or they can go to my website, boyerlaw.net, and I've got a place on there where they can indicate what their question is or what their dispute is, and then press the send button, and that comes to me. When you call my office, you will oftentimes get me on the phone.
Hey. Imagine that.
If I'm not busy, I'll answer my phone. Unfortunately, the phone rings a lot, so a lot of times I'll be on the phone when someone calls, but you'll get my voicemail, and I try to answer all of my calls that day as quickly as possible. Sometimes it doesn't happen until early evening, but I do my best to get back that day and try to answer people's questions. And then sometimes you'll get my office administrator who will take notes and let the potential client, let the caller know when I might be able to get back. And as I say, if a lot of times when people call me, I will, if I have the time, if I don't have to call them back, at a time that we agree upon, I can talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes and resolve their dispute right there and then.
I love that thought almost as much as I love the time that we've shared today. Richard L. Boyer, gang, Law Office of Richard Boyer. You can catch him, as he said, at boyerlaw.net, or you can call him at 858-481-8757. That number one more time, 858-481-8757. Rick, thank you so much for leaving us all a little better than how you found us.
My pleasure, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
And Stash Nation, don't go nowhere. We got the second hour coming up. Have you heard about the big festival in Del Mar called Kaboo? Well, guess what? We got Kaboo in the house. We're going to be talking all about that right next after this break. Hang out.